The first thing the human noticed about the station was that it expected him to break. The pressure of it pressed inward not through gravity or atmosphere, but through assumptions embedded in every corridor, every measured light, every calibrated hum of alien engineering. The structure was a lattice of grown crystal and layered alloys, shaped by intelligences that believed all beings arrived with a tolerance that could be quantified, exceeded, and then corrected. Correction, in their lexicon, meant compliance or collapse. The station was old, older than most of the polities that now sent delegates to it, and it had been designed when humanity was still confined to a single star and believed the universe would be quiet when it finally reached out. Kareth Iosefson did not look like someone built to endure. He was of average height by human standards, narrow in the shoulders, with skin that had known more filtered light than stellar glare. His hair had been cut short not for regulation, but for convenience, and his eyes carried the faint redness of someone who had slept too little during a transit that had taken longer than any human ship designer had intended to allow. He wore no ceremonial garb, no marks of rank beyond a simple band at his wrist that carried identifiers and permissions in layers of encrypted fields. The species that watched him disembark noted this and adjusted their internal predictions downward. Humans, they had decided, were prolific but fragile, inventive but inconsistent, loud but ultimately bendable. The docking chamber breathed as the seals disengaged, releasing a scent that was not air so much as a simulation of hospitality. It carried trace elements designed to calm nervous systems across a wide spectrum of biology. Kareth inhaled it and felt nothing beyond mild irritation at the sweetness. He had grown up on a mining habitat where the air recyclers were temperamental and the smells of metal and recycled water never quite faded. Comfort, he had learned early, was unreliable, and reliance on it was a mistake. A delegation waited at the far end of the chamber, their forms arranged in a way that suggested symmetry mattered to them. There were 6 of them, each representing a coalition of species that had negotiated power through treaties older than human writing. Their bodies varied, but their posture did not. They stood with the confidence of those who had never had to justify their continued existence to the universe. Their eyes, where eyes existed, tracked Kareth with professional curiosity, and beneath that curiosity lay a shared expectation that this meeting would be brief. The tallest among them stepped forward. Its name, translated into human auditory range, would have taken several seconds to pronounce, a sequence of tones and pressure shifts that conveyed lineage and accomplishment. The station's translators rendered it as Talarikvo, a compromise that flattened meaning but preserved intent. Talarikvo inclined its upper body in a gesture that humans had, in previous encounters, been told was a sign of respect. "You are the appointed voice of your species for this session," Talarikvo said. The words emerged not as sound, but as a modulation of the air that the translator at Kareth's wrist converted into human language. "Our records indicate that your people have requested reconsideration of the resource accords ratified 3 cycles ago. Those accords were finalized after extensive modeling. The models indicate that alteration would introduce instability." Kareth walked forward until he stood an appropriate distance from the delegation, close enough to be heard, far enough to avoid triggering any instinctive threat responses. He folded his hands behind his back, not as a gesture of submission, but because he had found it kept him from fidgeting. "The models you reference did not include several variables that have since become relevant," he said. "Human expansion into the outer systems has revealed constraints that were not apparent at the time of ratification." Another delegate, this one with a body composed of layered plates that shifted color as it processed information, emitted a sound that the translator rendered as a polite expression of disbelief. "Your species has demonstrated a capacity for rapid adaptation." The accords accounted for this. The projected shortfall you claim remains within tolerable limits. Tolerable to whom? Karath asked, his tone even. Your projections define tolerance in terms of survival thresholds. Humans define it in terms of what allows a civilization to remain human. There was a brief exchange among the delegates, conducted in a spectrum of signals that did not register to human senses. Karath waited. He had learned that impatience was often interpreted as weakness in interspecies negotiations. The station's lighting adjusted imperceptibly, shifting to a spectrum that favored the delegate's vision. It was a small reminder of whose environment this was. Talaric Vo turned its attention back to Karath. Your species agreed to the terms, the extraction limits, the transit restrictions, the settlement caps. You benefited from access to established trade routes and protection frameworks. The cost was proportionate. At the time, Karath said, we did not fully understand the cost. That is not a failing of honesty, but of experience. We were new to a system that has been in place longer than our recorded history. We are asking not for nullification, but for adjustment. The word adjustment carried weight. It implied flexibility, and flexibility implied that the system was not perfect. The delegates did not like that implication. The plated one shifted colors again, this time toward a spectrum that suggested irritation. Precedent matters. If we adjust for you, others will demand the same. Others already have, Karath replied, quietly, through informal channels. Your own internal reports acknowledge this. Species that were present at the system's founding have accrued exceptions layered so deeply they are functionally invisible. Humans have not had the time to build that kind of inertia. There was a pause. This one was longer, and the station's ambient hum seemed to deepen, as if the structure itself were listening. Talaric Vo's eyes narrowed slightly. You are well briefed. Karath allowed himself a small smile. We had to be. The consequences of being unprepared are not theoretical for us. The delegates conferred again. When they returned their attention to Karath, there was a subtle shift in their stance. The expectation of a quick dismissal had been replaced by something closer to appraisal. Your request, Talaric Vo said, will be considered. However, there are additional factors. Your species has demonstrated behaviors that are difficult to model. Your expansion patterns do not align with established norms. Your response to environmental stresses is unpredictable. These traits complicate integration. Karath nodded. We are aware. Awareness does not mitigate risk, another delegate said. This one's form was fluid, its surface rippling constantly as if it existed in a state of perpetual transition. Your kind persists in conditions that would degrade others. You resist optimization. You form attachments to inefficiencies. Karath's smile faded. We form attachments to people, he said, to places, to ideas that are not immediately profitable or stable. Those attachments are not inefficiencies to us. They are the reason we endure. The fluid delegate's surface stilled for a moment, an indication of surprise. Endurance without optimization leads to eventual failure. Perhaps, Karath said, or perhaps optimization without purpose leads to something worse. The station's systems recorded the exchange, tagging it for later analysis. Somewhere deep within its computational cores, models adjusted, probabilities shifted by fractions that would have been dismissed as noise if they had not persisted. The meeting continued for hours. Data was exchanged, arguments presented, counter-arguments dissected. Karath did not raise his voice or make grand gestures. He spoke steadily, drawing on histories that the delegates had skimmed but not fully absorbed. He spoke of habitats built from scrap and hope, of generations raised in artificial gravity that failed just often enough to teach caution, but not often enough to break spirits. He spoke of humans who had accepted loss as a constant companion and learned to move forward anyway. When the session finally adjourned, there was no resolution, but there was no dismissal either. Talaric Vo informed Karath that the council would deliberate and that he would be notified of their decision in due course. It was a procedural ending, deliberately neutral. Karath accepted it with a nod and turned to leave. As he walked back through the corridors toward the temporary quarters assigned to him, the station adjusted its internal parameters again. The calming sense shifted, the lighting warmed slightly. It was not kindness, it was data collection. The station was testing responses, seeking correlations. Karath felt the changes and ignored them. He had learned long ago that environments could be hostile without being overtly violent, and that survival often meant choosing which battles to acknowledge. His quarters were efficient, designed to meet the needs of a wide range of species without catering to any. The bed adjusted to his weight and shape. The walls displayed a neutral pattern that could be interpreted as calming by most visual systems. He sat on the edge of the bed and exhaled slowly. The meeting had gone better than expected, which made him uneasy. In his experience, apparent victories often concealed delayed consequences. He activated the band at his wrist, opening a secure channel to Earth. The signal would take time to propagate through the relays, but the act of sending it grounded him. He summarized the session, careful to note not just what had been said, but how it had been received. He emphasized the shift in the delegates' demeanor, the moment when dismissal had given way to calculation. When he finished, he closed the channel and lay back, staring at the ceiling. The station's hum was constant, a reminder that he was far from home, embedded in a system that did not share his assumptions or values. He thought of the people who had sent him here, of the billions who would never know the details of these negotiations but would live with their outcomes. The weight of that responsibility settled over him, familiar and heavy. Sleep came slowly. When it did, it was shallow, filled with fragments of memory and anticipation. He dreamed of corridors that narrowed as he walked them, of doors that opened onto voids that were not empty but waiting. He woke before the station's artificial dawn, his heart rate elevated, his mind already turning. The next cycle brought a summons. Not from the full council, but from a subcommittee tasked with evaluating behavioral anomalies. The phrase was bureaucratic, but the implication was clear. They wanted to understand humans not as petitioners, but as variables. The chamber for this meeting was smaller, more intimate. Only 3 delegates were present, including Talaric Vo. The fluid one was absent, replaced by a being whose form was angular, its movements precise. It radiated an air of analysis that made Karath think of instruments rather than individuals. "We have reviewed your historical data," the angular delegate said without preamble. "Your species has experienced repeated existential threats, environmental collapse, internal conflict, resource scarcity. In several instances, extinction probabilities exceeded acceptable thresholds. And yet we are here," Karath said. "Yes," the delegate replied. "That is the anomaly. Other species encountering similar conditions either adapt through structural modification or fragment into non-viable subgroups. Humans persist without significant alteration to their fundamental biology." "We alter our societies," Karath said, "our technologies, our narratives. We do not always change our bodies, but we change how we live." The delegate's eyes flickered. "Your narratives," it said, "we have difficulty quantifying them." "Stories are hard to model," Karath agreed. "They are not just information, they are context, motivation. They tell us who we are and who we want to be." Talaric Vo observed silently as the exchange continued. Finally, it spoke. "There is concern that your species' persistence is not sustainable within the current framework. You resist constraints that others accept. You question premises that underpin stability." "Stability for whom?" Karath asked again, gently this time. "The framework you reference has maintained peace among its members, but it has also entrenched disparities. Humans are not comfortable with systems that require perpetual disadvantage for some to ensure comfort for others." The angular delegate leaned forward. "Disadvantage is relative. Optimization requires sacrifice. Sacrifice imposed from above breeds resentment," Karath said. "We have learned that lesson at great cost. When sacrifice is chosen, it can be endured. When it is mandated without voice, it corrodes. The delegates exchanged looks. There was something like uncertainty there now, a crack in the assumption that humans would eventually conform or fail. The station recorded the biometric data, the micro-expressions, the deviations from predicted responses. Each data point nudged the models further from their original conclusions. "This session will inform the Council's deliberations," Talarikvo said at last. "You will remain on the station until a decision is reached." Karath inclined his head. "I understand." As he left the chamber, he felt the weight of countless eyes, both literal and metaphorical. He was not just representing humanity, he was, in a way, being studied as an exemplar of it. The thought was unsettling, but it also sparked a quiet resolve. Humans had been studied before, categorized, and underestimated. They had survived empires and ideologies that had declared them obsolete. Back in his quarters, Karath sat and began to write, not a report but a letter to his sister on a habitat orbiting a dim red star. He wrote of the station's strange beauty, of the way the corridors curved in defiance of Euclidean expectation. He wrote of the delegates, of their certainty and their cracks. He did not mention the fear that sometimes gnawed at him, the sense that humanity stood at a threshold that could lead to integration or isolation. He wrote instead of stubbornness, of the quiet refusal to accept that survival alone was enough. When he finished, he sent the letter and leaned back, closing his eyes. Outside his quarters, the station continued its endless calculations, its models striving to account for a species that did not fit neatly into its equations. Somewhere deep within those calculations, a new variable was taking shape, one that would challenge assumptions that had stood unexamined for millennia. The universe had expected humans to break, to bend, to become something else under pressure. It was beginning, slowly, reluctantly, to consider the possibility that they would not. The station did not sleep, but it observed rhythms that approximated rest cycles for the benefit of its occupants. Lights dimmed in sections, ambient vibrations softened, and non-essential transit corridors slowed their flow. Karath moved through these quieter hours with deliberate calm, aware that his presence was still being tracked even when no formal summons had been issued. He had long since accepted that privacy, in the absolute sense, was a luxury humanity had relinquished when it stepped onto the interstellar stage. What mattered was not whether one was observed, but whether one allowed that observation to dictate behavior. He spent the first portion of the cycle reviewing archived records the Council had granted him access to, a curated selection intended to demonstrate the stability and necessity of the existing framework. The documents were dense, layered with assumptions so deeply embedded they were rarely articulated. Karath read them carefully, not to dispute their surface logic, but to understand the values beneath. Stability was treated as an end in itself. Continuity was prioritized over adaptability. Suffering was acceptable if it was evenly distributed among those deemed less essential. These were not malicious principles, but they were impersonal, and Karath knew from human history how easily impersonality could become cruelty when elevated to doctrine. As he read, he made notes not on the margins of the documents, which would have been visible to the station's oversight systems, but in his own memory, mapping patterns and omissions. He noted which species were referenced frequently and which appeared only as footnotes. He noted the language used to describe resource allocation, the subtle framing that cast extraction as stewardship and limitation as generosity. The framework had been designed by those who benefited most from it, and over time that bias had become invisible even to its architects. The next summons came sooner than expected. This time it was not a council chamber, but a transit pod, one of the station's internal conveyances adapted to accommodate multiple physiologies. The message was brief, lacking the formalities of earlier communications. Attendance requested, location provided, no agenda. Karath felt a familiar tightening in his chest, the instinctive response to uncertainty that he had learned to acknowledge without indulging. The pod carried him toward the station's inner strata, where the grown crystal gave way to older, denser materials. This was the station's core, the region where its oldest systems resided, where decisions were not just debated, but enacted. The pod's walls displayed shifting patterns of light that responded to his gaze, a feature designed to distract and soothe. He focused instead on steady breathing, grounding himself in the physicality of the moment. When the pod opened, he stepped into a chamber unlike any he had yet seen. It was vast, but not empty. The space was filled with structures that resembled neither machinery nor architecture, but something in between, a forest of interlocking forms that pulsed faintly with internal energy. At the center stood a single figure, smaller than the council delegates, its form compact and unassuming. It turned as Karath approached, revealing a face that was almost human in its symmetry, though the eyes were wrong, too reflective, as if they contained layers beyond simple biology. "I am called Sevet," the figure said, its voice emerging directly into Karath's auditory nerves without the intermediary of air. "I oversee integrative assessment." Karath inclined his head. "I am Karath Iosfson." Sevet studied him in silence for several seconds. Karath resisted the urge to fill the space with words. He had learned that silence, in such contexts, was rarely empty. Finally, Sevet gestured toward the surrounding structures. "This station is more than a meeting place," it said. "It is a repository of decisions. Each form you see represents a consensus reached, a conflict resolved, a variable constrained. The framework you challenge is not abstract, it is embodied here." "I understand," Karath said. "That is why the consequences matter." Sevet's eyes flickered, a subtle shift that suggested interest. "Your species has not been present long enough to have forms here, no embodied consensus. No resolved conflicts at this scale, and yet you question the legitimacy of those that exist." "We question their completeness," Karath replied, "not their history." Sevet moved closer, its steps precise. "You speak as if incompleteness is a flaw." "It is a reality," Karath said. "Frameworks built by finite beings cannot anticipate all futures. The question is whether they can adapt when confronted with what they did not foresee." Sevet turned away, its gaze sweeping across the chamber. "Adaptation introduces uncertainty. Uncertainty destabilizes. Only if stability is defined as stasis," Karath said. "Humans define stability as the capacity to absorb change without losing core values." "What are your core values?" Sevet asked, turning back. Karath did not answer immediately. He considered the question carefully, aware that any response would be analyzed and abstracted. "We value continuity of agency," he said at last. "The ability of individuals and communities to make meaningful choices about their lives. We value resilience, not as mere survival, but as the capacity to recover with identity intact. We value connection, even when it complicates efficiency." Sevet regarded him for a long moment. "These values are subjective." "All values are," Karath said, "even those presented as universal." Sevet's gaze sharpened. "The framework has prevented large-scale conflict for many cycles. It has optimized resource distribution across thousands of species. Your challenge risks undermining that achievement." "Our challenge seeks to prevent a different kind of conflict," Karath said. "One born of accumulated inequity and suppressed agency. Peace maintained by constraint alone is brittle." Sevet was silent again. When it spoke, its tone had shifted, less formal, more probing. "Your species survived multiple self-inflicted catastrophes. Many would argue that this demonstrates a lack of fitness for broader integration." Karath met its gaze steadily. "It demonstrates that we learn slowly and imperfectly," he said. "It also demonstrates that we do learn. We are still here not because we avoided mistakes, but because we refuse to let mistakes define our end." Sevet stepped back, as if reassessing its physical distance. "There are factions within the council," it said. that view your species as a destabilizing influence. They argue that accommodation will encourage dissent among other marginal members. And there are factions that see us as a test, Karath said, of whether the framework can evolve. Sevit did not deny it. If the framework fails to evolve, it said, the consequences would be severe. If it refuses to evolve, Karath replied, the consequences will be inevitable. The chamber's structures pulsed slightly brighter, responding to fluctuations in Sevit's neural activity. The station was listening closely now, its ancient systems parsing the exchange for implications. Sevit seemed aware of this and adjusted its posture, becoming once more the overseer rather than the interlocutor. You will remain available, Sevit said. There may be further assessments. Karath inclined his head again. I will. As he left the chamber, he felt a strange mix of apprehension and cautious optimism. Sevit had not dismissed him. More importantly, it had engaged not just with his arguments, but with the values behind them. That did not guarantee a favorable outcome, but it suggested that the conversation was no longer superficial. The days that followed were a study in waiting. Karath was not summoned again immediately, but he was not idle. Representatives from other species, those with less formal standing, began to seek him out in public spaces where such interactions could be plausibly coincidental. They spoke obliquely, careful not to attract scrutiny, but their messages were clear. They had watched humanity's entry into the framework with interest and unease. They recognized in human persistence something that resonated with their own suppressed frustrations. One such encounter took place in a communal nutrient exchange, a space designed to accommodate a wide range of dietary needs. Karath was sampling a synthesized meal that approximated familiar textures when a being with a segmented body and multiple sensory appendages settled nearby. Its species name translated poorly, rendered as a string of descriptive phrases. The translator simplified it to Arquin. You are the human voice, Arquin said, its appendages twitching in patterns that suggested nervousness. You speak of adjustment. I do, Karath said. Our quotas were set generations ago, Arquin continued. We accepted them because resistance was discouraged. We adapted. But our adaptation has costs. Cultural erosion, biological stress. We endure, but we diminish. Karath listened without interrupting. What would you want? He asked when Arquin paused. Arquin hesitated. Not dominance, not reversal, recognition that endurance alone is not success. Karath nodded. That is what we are arguing. Similar conversations followed, each reinforcing the sense that humanity's challenge had touched a nerve that ran deeper than any single set of accords. The framework had always presented itself as inclusive, but inclusion had often meant assimilation. Those who could not or would not assimilate paid the price quietly. The council could not ignore this undercurrent forever. When the next summons came, it was to a full session, the largest Karath had yet attended. The chamber was filled with representatives, their forms arranged in complex patterns that reflected alliances and hierarchies. The atmosphere was tense, the station's environmental controls working harder to maintain equilibrium across divergent physiologies. Talarikvo presided, its posture rigid. We convene to address the human petition and its broader implications, it said. Deliberations have revealed divisions. Karath stood at the designated position, feeling the weight of countless gazes. He reminded himself that he was not alone, that every human who had struggled under constraints, every species that had endured quiet diminishment, stood with him in principle, if not in presence. A delegate from a founding species spoke first, its voice resonant with authority. The framework has served us well. To alter it now, at the behest of a relative newcomer, is reckless. Another delegate countered, this one from a species that had joined later but accrued influence through trade. Recklessness lies in ignoring accumulating pressures. The human case has illuminated systemic rigidity. Voices rose, arguments overlapping, the chamber's acoustics shifting to accommodate the cacophony. Karath listened, intervening only when directly addressed. He had learned that sometimes the most powerful statement was restraint. When he was finally invited to speak, he did not repeat his earlier arguments. Instead, he told a story. Not a myth or a song, but a simple account of a human settlement on a marginal world, one that had been deemed barely viable by predictive models. The settlers had gone anyway, driven by overcrowding and hope. The environment had been harsher than expected. Crops failed. Systems broke. By all metrics, the settlement should have collapsed. But they stayed, Kareth said, his voice carrying through the chamber. They adapted not by becoming something else, but by leaning into who they were. They shared resources. They accepted hardship collectively. They redefined success not as growth but as continuity. That settlement still exists. It is not prosperous by your standards, but it is alive, and its people consider their lives meaningful. He looked around the chamber. Your framework would have flagged that outcome as suboptimal. It would have redirected those resources elsewhere. It would have erased that story before it began. Silence followed, heavy and charged. The delegates were not moved by sentiment alone, but they were not immune to its implications. The station's models struggled with the narrative, its algorithms searching for quantifiable takeaways. Talarikvo spoke at last. Meaning is not a metric. No, Kareth said, but it is a motivator. It is why species persist even when models predict failure. Ignore it and you miscalculate. The debate continued, but the tone had shifted. It was no longer about whether humans were an exception to be managed, but whether the framework itself had become too rigid to account for the diversity it claimed to support. When the session adjourned, no decision was announced. Instead, a process was initiated, one that had not been used in many cycles. A comprehensive review of the framework's foundational assumptions. It was a slow mechanism, designed to prevent hasty change, but its activation alone was significant. Kareth returned to his quarters exhausted but alert. He knew this was not a victory. Reviews could take cycles, and outcomes could be diluted by compromise. But the door had been opened, and that mattered. As he prepared to rest, he considered the irony that humanity's greatest strength in this arena was not its technology or numbers, but its refusal to accept that endurance without agency was enough. The universe had systems built on inevitability. Humans, it seemed, were determined to remain improbable. Outside his quarters, the station adjusted once more, its ancient structures resonating with the faintest hint of uncertainty. For the first time in its long existence, it was not merely processing new data, but questioning the completeness of its own conclusions. The review process altered the station in subtle ways long before any formal conclusions were reached. Corridors that had once followed fixed patterns began to reroute dynamically, responding not just to traffic optimization, but to emergent clusters of interaction. Meeting chambers were reconfigured more frequently, their shapes shifting to accommodate not only biological needs, but conversational dynamics. These changes were not announced. They were side effects of the framework turning its analytical tools inward, testing itself against scenarios it had previously dismissed as noise. Kareth noticed these shifts immediately. Humans were good at noticing environments in transition, a trait honed by centuries of living in systems that were never quite finished. The station felt less certain now, its responses fractionally delayed, its predictive adjustments less smooth. To many species, this would have been deeply unsettling, but to Kareth it felt almost reassuring. Uncertainty, he knew, was not the enemy of survival. Unexamined certainty was. He was summoned again, this time not to argue but to observe. The council had convened a mixed working assembly, drawing representatives from across the hierarchy, including several species that rarely held direct voice in central deliberations. Officially, the assembly existed to provide supplementary perspectives. Unofficially, it was a controlled experiment, a way to see what happened when suppressed variables were allowed limited expression. The chamber assigned to the assembly was irregular, its walls asymmetrical, the floor textured to provide sensory feedback to a range of locomotion styles. Karth took his place among the observers, deliberately positioned not at the center, but not at the periphery either. He was not the focus here, but he was not invisible. The first to speak was a being whose species had been categorized for centuries as auxiliary. They provided labor and specialized biological services, but held no formal decision-making power. Their form was compact, resilient, adapted to extreme pressure differentials. Their voice, when translated, carried a careful precision. "We have endured under the framework," the being said. Endurance has been cited as evidence of success, but endurance has limits. Our reproductive cycles have lengthened, our cultural transmission has degraded. We are stable, but we are thinning. A delegate from a dominant species responded, its tone measured but dismissive. "Stability necessarily involves trade-offs. Your species continues to exist." "Yes," the auxiliary delegate said. "But we no longer grow toward what we once were. We are optimized to function, not to flourish." The word flourish rippled through the chamber, triggering minor adjustments in translation algorithms. It was not a term often used in formal proceedings. Karth watched as several delegates reacted with visible discomfort. Flourishing implied excess, individuality, deviation from the mean. Another marginalized representative spoke next, this one from a species that had adapted to the framework by fragmenting itself into specialized subpopulations. "We were told that division was efficient," it said, and it was, but we no longer remember how to be whole. Our subpopulations cannot coexist outside prescribed roles. We have lost internal diversity. The assembly continued in this vein, a slow accumulation of testimonies that painted a picture the framework's architects had never fully confronted. The system had preserved life, but often at the cost of vitality. It had prevented collapse, but sometimes by flattening difference. Throughout it all, Karth remained silent, his role not to speak, but to witness. He sensed that his presence mattered less for what he said and more for what he represented. Humanity was proof that a species could endure chaos without surrendering all its contradictions. That proof unsettled assumptions that had calcified over millennia. When the assembly concluded, Sevet approached him in a quieter annex of the chamber. "The data gathered today will complicate the review," Sevet said. "I imagine that is the point," Karth replied. Sevet regarded him with an expression that might have been wry if applied to a human face. "You have introduced a destabilizing reference frame, not through force, but through example." "Examples are harder to refute than arguments," Karth said. "They persist even when inconvenient." Sevet was silent for a moment. "There is resistance," it said, "not only ideological, structural. The framework is deeply integrated into resource flows, defense protocols, predictive governance. Alteration at the foundational level risks cascading failure." "I am aware," Karth said. "Humans live with cascading failure as a constant possibility. We design systems expecting them." "That expectation," Sevet said, "is itself anomalous." Karth smiled faintly. "We learned it the hard way." In the cycles that followed, resistance became more overt. Delegates from the oldest factions began to challenge not just the human petition, but the legitimacy of the review itself. They argued that the framework's longevity was evidence of its optimality. They framed dissent as ingratitude, instability as moral failing. In private channels, they lobbied for acceleration of the process toward a predetermined conclusion that would preserve existing power distributions. The station reflected this tension. Its internal harmonics fluctuated, the hum sometimes rising into frequencies that set Karth's teeth on edge. Maintenance drones moved more erratically, responding to competing directives. The station was not breaking, but it was straining, caught between the imperative to preserve and the necessity to reconsider. Karth was not immune to the strain. He felt it in the tightening of his shoulders, the persistent fatigue that no amount of rest fully alleviated. There were moments, alone in his quarters, when doubt crept in. He wondered whether humanity had overreached, whether this challenge would provoke backlash that would leave his species worse off than before. He thought of the fragile footholds humans had established across distant systems, of settlements still vulnerable to shifts in policy and perception. During one such moment, a message arrived from Earth. It was not from any official body, but from a collective of educators and archivists who had been following the proceedings as closely as public channels allowed. They sent him records of human history, not as briefing material, but as reminder. Accounts of cities rebuilt after devastation, of cultures revived after near erasure, of movements that had failed repeatedly before reshaping societies in ways no model could have predicted. The accompanying note was brief. You are not wrong to try. Even if you fail, the attempt matters. Karath sat with that for a long time. Humans had never been guaranteed success. Their stories were not narratives of inevitable triumph, but of persistence in the face of uncertainty. That, he realized, was what truly distinguished them in this arena. Not that they always won, but that they continued to assert meaning even when victory was unlikely. The next major development came unexpectedly. A minor system on the periphery of the framework experienced a resource shock, the result of a predictive failure compounded by delayed response. Under normal protocols, the affected populations would have been triaged, support allocated according to priority tiers that favored central nodes. This time, however, the review process had introduced provisional flexibility. Local actors were authorized to make adaptive decisions without waiting for central approval. The result was chaotic. Resource flows rerouted unpredictably, alliances shifted, some inefficiencies spiked, but something else happened as well. Species that had long been passive recipients of directives coordinated laterally, sharing reserves, improvising solutions tailored to their specific needs. The crisis did not resolve cleanly, but it did not escalate into collapse either. The data was impossible to ignore. Sevet presented it to the Council in stark terms. The deviation from protocol increased short-term instability, it said. However, long-term resilience indicators improved. Recovery trajectories exceeded baseline projections. The chamber erupted in debate. Some delegates seized on the increased instability as proof of danger, others focused on the improved resilience. For the first time, the metrics themselves were contested, not just their interpretation. Karath was invited to speak during this session, not as petitioner, but as analyst. He chose his words carefully. What you observed, he said, is not efficiency in the traditional sense. It is redundancy, overlap, local agency. These are features humans build into systems because we expect failure. They look wasteful until they are needed. A senior delegate challenged him directly. Your species accepts inefficiency because you lack the discipline to enforce optimal behavior. Karath met its gaze. We accept inefficiency because optimal behavior is context-dependent, he said. Centralized models cannot account for all variables. They cannot feel urgency or fear or loyalty. Local actors can. The argument did not end there, but the seed had been planted. The framework, long justified by its predictive superiority, now faced evidence that its rigidity could be a liability. In the aftermath of the session, Sevet approached Karath with something like caution in its demeanor. There is a proposal, it said, a limited pilot, application of adaptive principles to a defined region, oversight would be shared. Karath's pulse quickened, though he kept his expression neutral. And humanity's role, advisory, Sevet said, and participatory. Your species would be subject to the same uncertainties as others. Karath nodded. We are used to that. The proposal would not satisfy everyone. It would anger some, frighten others, but it represented movement, a crack in the monolith that had seemed immovable. Karath knew better than to celebrate prematurely. Pilots could be sabotaged, data could be spun, but the possibility itself mattered. As he returned to his quarters, the station's lighting shifted again, this time not to soothe, but to clarify, edges sharper, contrasts higher. It was as if the structure itself were adjusting its vision, trying to see more clearly a future that no longer fit neatly into its established parameters. Kareth stood for a moment at the viewport, looking out into the dense starfield beyond the station. Each point of light represented systems with their own histories, their own struggles between endurance and meaning. Humanity was one among many, but it carried with it a stubborn insistence that survival should be more than mere continuation. The framework had been built to manage inevitability. Humans, it seemed, had arrived to argue with it. The announcement of the pilot spread through the station with a speed that surprised even those who had proposed it. Official channels framed it as a technical initiative, a controlled exploration of adaptive governance under constrained conditions. Unofficially, it was understood as something far more disruptive, an admission that the framework, for all its age and authority, might not be sufficient as it was. Kareth felt the shift almost immediately in how others regarded him. Where once there had been dismissal or wary curiosity, there was now calculation, and in some cases, expectation. The pilot region selected lay along a complex junction of trade routes and marginal systems, an area historically treated as peripheral precisely because its variability made it difficult to model. Species that had learned to live with uncertainty long before the Council acknowledged it. That history made the region both an ideal testbed and a political risk. If adaptive principles failed, the failure could be contained. If they succeeded, the implications would be impossible to ignore. Kareth was assigned to the advisory cohort, a small group composed of representatives from several species, each chosen not for seniority, but for experience navigating instability. There were engineers accustomed to improvising with limited resources, cultural mediators from societies shaped by fragmentation, and strategists whose careers had been built not on prediction, but on response. The group met not in a formal chamber, but in a modular space that could be reconfigured at will, its walls and surfaces responding to the needs of the moment. The first meetings were cautious, heavy with unspoken fears. The participants understood that they were being watched, not just by the Council, but by countless stakeholders invested in the framework's preservation. Every suggestion, every deviation would be scrutinized for signs of recklessness or incompetence. Kareth listened more than he spoke, aware that humans were already perceived as the catalyst. He did not want to confirm suspicions that this was a human-driven experiment rather than a collective one. When he did speak, it was often to reframe questions rather than answer them. Instead of asking how to optimize resource flows, he asked who needed flexibility most when flows were disrupted. Instead of debating ideal allocation models, he asked what mechanisms allowed communities to recover dignity after loss. These were not questions with clean answers, but they shifted the conversation away from abstract efficiency and toward lived experience. Not everyone appreciated the shift. One strategist, a being whose species had thrived under the framework's predictability, challenged him openly. "Your approach lacks rigor," it said. "You replace quantifiable metrics with subjective assessments. That invites bias." "Metrics are never neutral," Kareth replied calmly. "They encode values whether acknowledged or not. Subjective experience is data. Ignoring it introduces its own bias." The strategist bristled, but did not respond immediately. Others in the room watched closely. Over time, the tension softened into something more productive. The group began to experiment, not with grand reforms, but with small, localized adjustments. Decision authority was temporarily delegated to regional councils composed of those most affected by outcomes. Resource buffers were diversified rather than centralized. Redundancy was introduced deliberately, even when it appeared inefficient. As the pilot unfolded, reports from the region painted a complex picture. There were failures, some dramatic. A trade hub misjudged demand and faced shortages. A newly empowered council splintered over internal disagreements. These incidents were seized upon by critics as evidence of the framework's wisdom. But there were also successes that resisted easy categorization. Communities responded to shortages by sharing knowledge rather than hoarding goods. Disputes were resolved through negotiation rather than appeal to distant authority. Recovery times shortened even when losses were greater. Sevit monitored these developments closely, its analyses growing more nuanced with each cycle. When it met with Karath to discuss preliminary findings, its tone was markedly different from their earlier conversations. The data does not converge cleanly, it said. Outcomes vary widely, predictive confidence is lower. And resilience? Karath asked. Sevit paused, an unusual delay. Resilience indicators have increased across multiple dimensions, it admitted. Cultural retention, psychological stability, cooperative behavior under stress. Karath nodded. Those are hard to quantify, he said, but they matter when systems fail. Sevit regarded him with an intensity that bordered on introspective. Your species' tolerance for uncertainty appears to be a functional advantage, it said. You do not seek to eliminate risk, only to survive it. We seek to live with it, Karath corrected gently. Risk is part of being alive. The pilot's visibility grew despite efforts to contain it. Other regions began to request similar autonomy, citing the pilot as precedent. The Council faced mounting pressure, not just from marginalized species, but from mid-tier factions that recognized opportunity in flexibility. The Old Guard responded by accelerating their own initiatives, tightening controls in core systems, emphasizing the dangers of fragmentation. The station reflected this polarization. Some sectors grew more rigid, access controls tightening, protocols enforced with renewed zeal. Others became more fluid, experimental spaces multiplying as oversight loosened. It was as if two philosophies were coexisting uneasily within the same structure, each testing the other's limits. Karath found himself increasingly drawn into informal networks, conversations that took place in transit corridors and shared spaces, where official records were thinner. Species that had once avoided attention now spoke candidly about their hopes and fears. Some saw the pilot as a chance to reclaim agency. Others worried it would provoke retaliation, that the framework's guardians would reassert control once the experiment had served its purpose. One encounter stayed with him. A representative from a species that had been nearly erased centuries earlier approached him quietly. Their people survived only as a diaspora, their home system repurposed long ago under perfectly legal accords. We endured, the representative said, but we lost ourselves. If this change had come sooner, perhaps. They did not finish the thought. They did not need to. Karath felt the weight of that unfinished sentence settle heavily. It reinforced a truth he had sensed from the beginning. This was not just about resources or governance. It was about time, about what could be recovered and what could only be honored. The Council eventually convened to assess the pilot's continuation. The session was contentious from the outset. Critics highlighted failures, framing them as unacceptable risks. Supporters pointed to resilience gains, arguing that short-term instability was a reasonable price for long-term adaptability. The debate was no longer abstract. Real lives, real systems were implicated. When Karath was invited to address the Council, he felt a familiar steadiness settle over him. He did not speak as a petitioner or advisor, but as a witness. No system can guarantee safety, he said. The framework promised that, and in doing so, it narrowed the range of acceptable existence. The pilot does not promise safety, it offers capacity, the capacity to respond, to recover, to choose. A delegate from the Old Guard challenged him sharply. Choice leads to error. Yes, Karath said without hesitation, and error leads to learning. A system that forbids error also forbids growth. The chamber was silent for a long moment. Even those inclined to disagree could not dismiss the simplicity of the statement. It echoed uncomfortably against the framework's long history of minimizing deviation. The Council did not reach a definitive resolution that cycle. Instead, it authorized an extension of the pilot and the creation of additional test regions. It was a compromise, cautious and imperfect. But it marked a shift from containment to exploration. As Kareth left the chamber, he felt neither triumph nor relief, only a deep, tired hope. Change was slower than he might have wished, but it was moving. Humanity's role in that movement was still precarious. They could be blamed if things went wrong, marginalized if things went right. But the alternative, silence and acquiescence, would have been a different kind of failure. Back in his quarters, Kareth looked again at the stars beyond the viewport. He thought of Earth, of the countless experiments humanity had run on itself, most without permission, many ending in pain. He thought of the stubborn belief that had survived them all, that meaning was worth the risk. The framework had been built to last forever. Humans, it seemed, were content with something more fragile, something that could bend, crack, and be remade. The universe was beginning to learn that endurance did not always look like permanence, and that sometimes the most unyielding force was the refusal to stop becoming. The extension of the pilot did not calm the station. If anything, it intensified the undercurrents that had been building since the review began. What had once been theoretical disagreements hardened into strategic positioning. Delegations reorganized their internal hierarchies. Long-standing alliances were quietly renegotiated, clauses reinterpreted to allow just enough flexibility to hedge against multiple futures. The framework was still intact, but it now carried stress fractures that no amount of procedural language could fully conceal. For Kareth, the change manifested most clearly in access. Doors that had once opened automatically now required additional verification. Some channels grew noisier with unsolicited communications, while others fell abruptly silent. He was neither ostracized nor embraced outright, instead occupying an uncomfortable middle ground as both asset and liability. It was a familiar place for a human negotiator, and he settled into it with practiced restraint. The advisory cohort expanded as new test regions came online. Each region adapted the pilot's principles differently, shaped by local histories and constraints. In one, authority rotated rapidly among community councils, producing bursts of innovation followed by periods of confusion. In another, traditional hierarchies remained, but were overlaid with emergency autonomy protocols that allowed rapid deviation when conditions deteriorated. The diversity of outcomes frustrated those who sought clean comparisons, but it fascinated Kareth. To him, the variation was not noise, but evidence that adaptability could not be standardized without losing its essence. Sevit's analyses became increasingly complex, its reports layered with conditional statements and probabilistic ranges that would have been unacceptable in earlier eras. When Kareth reviewed one such report at Sevit's invitation, he noted the shift immediately. "You are no longer trying to force convergence," he said. Sevit inclined its head slightly. "Convergence is proving to be an unreliable indicator of system health," it admitted. "Divergence, when bounded by shared principles, appears to correlate with survivability." Kareth smiled faintly. "Humans took a long time to learn that," he said. "We kept trying to make everyone the same. It never worked." Sevit studied him closely. "Your species' internal conflicts were severe," it said, "yet you did not fragment beyond recovery." "We came close," Kareth replied, "more than once. What saved us wasn't unity of belief. It was the refusal to accept that disagreement meant annihilation. That refusal was being tested now, not just within humanity, but across the framework. As adaptive regions multiplied, so did disputes over boundaries, authority, and responsibility. Some conflicts were resolved locally through mechanisms that would have been unthinkable under the old system. Others escalated, requiring intervention that tested how much autonomy the Council was truly willing to tolerate. One such escalation occurred in a region where a dominant species attempted to reassert control over its neighbors. citing the chaos of adaptation as justification. Under the old framework, the move would have been sanctioned quietly, order restored at the expense of the weaker parties. This time, the affected communities appealed laterally, coordinating a response that combined economic pressure, shared defense commitments, and a public appeal to the Council framed in the language of the pilot's principles. The Council's response was delayed and conflicted. When it came, it was measured, stopping short of full condemnation, but refusing to legitimize the power grab. The dominant species complied reluctantly, its influence blunted. The outcome sent shockwaves through the station. It was the first time in living memory that authority had been checked not by superior force or central decree, but by a coalition empowered by flexibility. Critics were quick to frame the incident as dangerous precedent. Supporters hailed it as proof that adaptive systems could self-correct. Karath watched the debate unfold with a mixture of pride and unease. This was what humans had argued for, but he knew that self-correction was never painless. Someone always bore the cost of learning. The cost became personal when Karath received word of unrest in a human settlement within one of the pilot regions. The settlement had embraced local autonomy enthusiastically, dismantling centralized oversight in favor of community councils. For a time, it flourished. Then a sequence of misjudgments compounded by environmental stress pushed it toward collapse. Resources dwindled, factions hardened, old resentments resurfaced. The news hit Karath harder than he expected. He requested detailed reports, poring over them late into the cycle. The patterns were painfully familiar, echoes of Earth's past repeating on a new stage. When Sevet joined him to discuss the situation, its tone was cautious. "This outcome will be cited," it said, "as evidence of the risks you advocate." "Yes," Karath said quietly, "and rightly so." Sevet paused. "You do not dispute the criticism." "No," Karath said, "adaptation doesn't prevent failure. It changes how failure unfolds and what can be salvaged afterward." "Can this settlement be salvaged?" Sevet asked. Karath considered the question carefully. "Not in its current form," he said, "but the people can be, if support is offered without erasing their agency." Sevet processed this. Under the framework, intervention would involve restructuring governance and reallocating population. "I know," Karath said, "and it would solve the immediate problem while teaching the wrong lesson." After extended deliberation, the Council authorized a hybrid response, blending old protocols with adaptive support. Aid was provided, but control was not seized. Mediators facilitated dialogue rather than imposing directives. The settlement did not return to its previous state. Some left, some stayed. The community reformed around different priorities, smaller and less ambitious, but more cohesive. The outcome satisfied no one completely, which Karath took as a sign of its authenticity. Humans, he knew, rarely achieved solutions that pleased everyone. What mattered was whether those solutions preserved the possibility of future choice. As the cycles passed, the framework's identity continued to shift. It did not collapse, nor did it transform entirely. Instead, it layered adaptation atop tradition, creating a patchwork that was uneven and sometimes contradictory. To some, this was failure. To Karath, it was the beginning of something alive. The Council eventually moved toward a formal decision regarding humanity's petition. The session was heavily anticipated, tension saturating the station. When Karath entered the chamber, he felt the accumulated weight of expectation settle over him. This was no longer about adjustments to quotas or routes. It was about whether the framework would acknowledge adaptability as a core principle rather than an exception. Talarikvo addressed the assembly, its voice steady but solemn. "The review has revealed both strengths and limitations in our long-standing system. Change carries risk. Stasis carries risk. We must choose which we are willing to bear." The decision, when announced, was neither sweeping nor symbolic. Humanity's accords would be revised, granting greater flexibility in expansion and resource negotiation. contingent on participatory responsibility within adaptive regions. More importantly, adaptability would be codified as a legitimate governance approach, no longer confined to pilots. The chamber reacted in waves. Relief, anger, calculation, fear. Kareth stood quietly, absorbing it all. This was not a victory in the heroic sense. It was a negotiated opening, fragile and contested, but it was real. After the session, Sevet approached him one last time in the chamber's periphery. "Your species has altered the trajectory of the framework," it said, "not by overpowering it, but by complicating it." Kareth exhaled slowly. "Complication is how life avoids stagnation," he said. Sevet regarded him with what might have been respect. "The future will be less predictable." "Good," Kareth said softly. "We're not very good at living in futures that are already decided." As he returned to his quarters to prepare for departure, Kareth felt the exhaustion of long strain finally begin to lift. The work was far from over. There would be backlash, reversals, unintended consequences. Humanity would make mistakes, as it always did, but it would make them openly, learning in public, refusing to retreat into the safety of imposed simplicity. Beyond the station's hull, the stars waited, indifferent and vast. Kareth looked at them not as a frontier to be conquered or optimized, but as a field of possibilities, each one demanding not just endurance, but intention. The framework had learned to survive. Now, slowly, it was learning to live. Departure was not immediate. Systems as old and interdependent as the framework did not pivot without reverberation, and the station required time to recalibrate itself to the decisions it had authorized. Kareth remained aboard for several cycles after the Council's ruling, a presence no longer central, but still symbolically charged. He was consulted less frequently, yet watched more closely, as though the station and its occupants were trying to determine whether humanity would press further now that the first barrier had shifted, or whether it would retreat, satisfied with partial recognition. During those cycles, Kareth took to walking sections of the station he had not previously visited. Some were ancient corridors rarely used, their surfaces worn smooth by species long gone or radically transformed. Others were newly reconfigured spaces designed to host adaptive councils, their modular architecture still bearing the sharpness of recent change. In these walks, he felt the layered history of the place more acutely than ever. The station was not a monolith, but a palimpsest, each era overwriting the last without fully erasing it. He encountered Sevet only once more in an unplanned way, in a transit junction where traffic flows intersected unpredictably due to ongoing recalibration. They stood together for a moment, watching a cluster of beings negotiate passage through gesture, signal, and brief bursts of translated speech. It was inefficient, slow, and oddly graceful. This would not have occurred before, Sevet observed. Routing would have been optimized, and nobody would have spoken to one another, Kareth said. Sevet considered that. Communication is an emergent variable, it said. It introduces error and understanding, Kareth replied, often at the same time. Sevet did not argue. When they parted, it inclined its head in a gesture that was no longer purely formal. Kareth took that as a sign not of agreement, but of ongoing consideration. He suspected Sevet would continue to evolve long after Kareth had returned to human space, its role subtly reshaped by exposure to a species that refused to stay within assigned parameters. Messages from Earth and the colonies grew more frequent as news of the Council's decision propagated. Some were celebratory, others cautious, a few openly critical. Not all humans agreed that integration with the framework on adaptive terms was desirable. There were factions that argued for withdrawal, for building parallel systems free from alien entanglement. Kareth understood their fears. Humanity's history was littered with examples of compromised autonomy and unintended dependence. He responded to these messages carefully, never claiming that the path chosen was safe or final. Instead, he emphasized that it was reversible, contingent, alive. "We are not binding ourselves to permanence," he wrote in one reply. "We are insisting on participation. Those are not the same thing." The final days on the station were marked by a quiet normalization of change. Adaptive councils continued their work. Old guard delegates adjusted their strategies, some entrenching, others cautiously experimenting. The station's systems stabilized around a new equilibrium that was less smooth but more responsive. It would never again be the perfectly optimized instrument it once was, but it would also never again be blind to the costs of that optimization. When clearance for departure finally came, it was accompanied by an unusual addendum. Karath was granted a standing invitation, a status that allowed him to return not as petitioner, but as contributor should future reviews require a human perspective. The language was carefully neutral, but the implication was clear. Humanity was no longer merely subject to the framework. It was now, however tenuously, part of its ongoing authorship. As Karath boarded the transport that would take him away from the station, he felt a sense of closure that surprised him. Not completion, but a completed phase. The doors sealed, and the vessel disengaged with a vibration that resonated through his bones. Through the viewport, the station receded, its vast structure catching the light of distant stars in facets that suggested both solidity and fragility. During the long transit home, Karath allowed himself a period of reflection he had postponed for too long. He thought of the auxiliary species that had spoken of thinning, of the fragmented civilization that no longer remembered how to be whole, of the human settlement that had nearly failed and then reformed into something smaller but truer. None of these outcomes fit neatly into the categories the framework had favored. All of them were, in their own way, alive. He recorded a final report, one not intended for immediate policy use, but for future historians. In it, he did not focus on treaties or metrics. He wrote about discomfort, about the resistance of old systems to new questions, about the danger of mistaking endurance for success. He wrote about how humans had been perceived as anomalous not because they were stronger or wiser, but because they carried forward contradictions they refused to resolve into simplicity. When the transport entered human-controlled space, familiar constellations emerging from the starfield, Karath felt a loosening in his chest he had not realized he was holding. Earth was still far away, but the cultural gravity of home asserted itself nonetheless. He knew the work awaiting him would be different but no less difficult. Advocacy would give way to implementation. Ideals would collide with budgets, politics, and human impatience. The framework would not transform overnight, and neither would humanity. There would be setbacks. There would be moments when adaptive principles were invoked as excuses for exploitation rather than safeguards against it. There would be voices claiming that the old way had been better, simpler, safer. Karath did not dismiss those voices. Simplicity was seductive, especially in a universe that offered so many ways to fail. But he also knew something else now, something the station itself had begun to learn. Systems built to last forever often forgot why they existed in the first place. They optimized survival until survival became hollow. Humans, flawed and stubborn, carried with them an insistence that survival had to mean something to those doing the surviving. As the transport adjusted its trajectory toward the inner systems, Karath closed his eyes and let the hum of the engines wash over him. He was tired, deeply so, but beneath the fatigue was a steady conviction. Humanity had not been invited into the universe as a finished product. It had arrived unfinished, carrying questions rather than answers, and that, he now believed, was its greatest contribution. The stars did not care about frameworks or councils. They would burn and fade on timescales no policy could touch. Against that vast indifference, unyielding minds mattered more than unchanging systems. Humanity would continue to stumble, argue, rebuild, and persist, not because it was destined to, but because it chose to, again and again, even when the universe expected it to break.